Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 of the least interesting compositions by 10 major composers, Part 2. Now, Part 1 attracted a certain amount of comment, and some of the pieces in Part 2, which I'd already done at the time that I did Part 1, were mentioned by you in discussing a possible Part 2. So I hope that you will enjoy seeing your choices actually appearing here by serendipity, not by command. And this list is, I think, equally uninteresting. As uninteresting as the first list was uninteresting. They're interesting lists, actually, about the uninteresting. Let's call it that. And let's get to it, shall we? Number 1, Haydn. Now, I know that some of you said, how on earth are you ever going to find an uninteresting piece by Haydn? Well, it was hard, I have to confess. And I'm leaving out the fact that he wrote like 100 and some odd baritone trios for his patron. You know, there are some commissioned works that really are less than interesting. And those are, as a group, possibly his least fascinating or enticing body of work. But no, there is a specific work. It is his Applausus cantata. Now, what is an Applausus cantata, you might wonder? Well, an Applausus cantata is a celebratory piece of occasional music. It's very similar to one of those sort of, opera things that people did for the, a royal wedding or something else for some occasion. But these are particularly dreary in that the Applausus cantata celebrates the anniversary of the installation of an abbot at an Austrian monastery. And the characters are allegorical characters. They are justice, prudence, fortitude, moral virtue, all of that junk. And they sing interminable, endless da capo arias about their particular embodiment. And, Haydn did the best he could with it, I'm sure, but it's still, it's long. It's in, like 2 hours, an hour and something, an hour and a half, a little more. And it contains these just endless da capo arias interspersed with recitatives. And the fascinating thing about the Applausus cantata, which will be the subject of another talk because it's just as interesting as the note on Beethoven's Wellington's Victory, is that Haydn wrote performance indications in a letter, which is one of the most important letters that we have about how music of that type, or Haydn's music of that type, was to be performed more generally as regards things like performance practice and what players were likely to do. And so that is going to be a separate discussion because it's very, very interesting about Haydn's least interesting piece of music or vocal work. Now, there is some kind of, I think, support for the notion that the Applausus cantata was indeed less than fascinating because Haydn took the arias and reused them as what they call contrafacta, that is, he set them to actual liturgical words and reused them in other pieces to salvage the best music. Because first of all, he knew that the thing was never going to be performed outside of the monastery where it presumably thrilled these monks to death. And second of all, he might have found himself, the poem, to be less than inspiring as a topic of musical illustration. And so there may have been a certain, let's just say, cognitive dissonance between the attractiveness of the music and the dullness of the words that he was forced to set. So anyway, Haydn's least interesting piece, the Applausus cantata. Go and prove it for yourself. But I'll do a talk about it later and we can have some more fun with it. So don't worry. Next, Prokofiev Symphony No. 4. Well, Prokofiev Symphony No. 4 is based on ballet music. And the ballet music is, I think it's mostly, what is it, The Prodigal Son or The Buffoon or one of those early ballets, which are rather enjoyable. As a symphony, however, the fourth never caught on. And so Prokofiev revised it and enlarged it and beefed it up to make a whole new symphony that never caught on. So you've got two versions of number four. And if you get a Prokofiev symphony cycle, you're likely to get both versions of number four. And so you get to hear Prokofiev's least interesting symphony twice. It is hands down his least symphonic, least persuasive. And it's funny too, because as a ballet, it works perfectly well. It's delightful. But somehow when he chunks it up and reshapes it and tries to formalize its outline, it just became, go figure. I think actually the reason it's his least interesting symphony is because it doesn't have any particularly pungent melodic character. And, those ballets, they get away with it because it's mostly rhythm. They're mostly rhythm and movement. And in a ballet, you can sort of do it. And the numbers are shorter, and so the contrasts are wider. But in the symphony, it just doesn't symphonize. Its symphonitude is dissymphoniacal. I mean, if you want to put it that way. So next, oh yes, Sibelius Scaramouche. Holy mackerel. This is a ballet. It's a ballet pantomime. And it's a ballet pantomime of a singularly dismal character. Sibelius, actually, when he agreed to write it, had no idea what he was getting into. He thought it was going to be a short little piece and whatnot. And then he got this scenario, and he was trapped. And he had to write the whole thing. It's his longest work, believe it or not. I mean, after, Kullervo, I think actually it's longer than Kullervo even. It's about 75 minutes, 80 minutes, something like that in its full form. There's also a suite, which is equally dreary. He wrote it. He also was restricted in his orchestration. He tried to make it interesting. It's for two separate instrumental ensembles, one of which has a piano. He did everything he could to try and perk this sucker up, and none of it worked. None of it worked at all. Does it have some interesting bits? Oh, sure. It's Sibelius. Of course it does. But on the whole, it is a bow wow of a piece. The plot is just wonderful. The plot is so uninteresting as well. It's a bunch of bored aristocrats are sitting around doing nothing, talking about how they're rich and bored. And this Scaramouche, he's like a Pied Piper type. He's like a troll. He shows up, and one of the boredest aristocratesses, the lady, he takes her into the forest and has his way with her, and she kills herself or kills him, and they all kill each other, and that's it. I mean, really, that's it. I mean, it's beyond uninteresting. It really is. And I remember, being a big Sibelius fan myself, I mean, wasn't it exciting to know that there was this big piece sitting out there, this huge ballet thing by Sibelius? And then, of course, Biss recorded the complete thing. There was a suite, and the suite wasn't like all that. And so you think to yourself, well, once I get the complete thing, it's going to be marvelous, just interesting. So you go, and we got the complete Biss recording as part of the complete Biss edition. And it only went downhill from there. So Sibelius' Scaramouche. Next, well, this next one might be an obvious one. Mendelssohn's St. Paul. Oh my. I mean, 19th century Victorian sacred oratorios are always an issue. They really are, unless they're Elgar's stuff, which is very interesting, or Mendelssohn's own Elijah, which is a masterpiece. I mean, the masterpiece, the early masterpiece in the genre. But before that, he wrote Paulus. Actually, it was in German. And it may be that the less English-directed or sort of direction of the work made it even duller than it needed to be. It was supposed to be a sort of modern updating of a Bach Passion, because it includes Lutheran chorales and things like that. And the story, of course, we know the story. And it's very pretty. It has beautiful numbers in it. It really does. I think part of the problem with it is that it doesn't really have much opportunity for evil women. Elijah has evil women and some good women. Women generally. I mean, women perk things up. And more than women just perking things up, excuse me, women are emotional. Women give composers an opportunity to let their hair down and write music that is not just sort of stoic and noble and really kind of go for it. Or at least go for it with as much as a Victorian sacred oratorio goes for anything. And St. Paul, well, it just never quite goes for it. And that's just a fact. I mean, you can listen to it for the pretty music, and otherwise it's best enjoyed in small bits. That's a fact of life. Sorry, folks, but there you go. And after that, well, let's jump over to Russia for a bit, shall we? Oh, Rimsky-Korsakov's Symphony No. 1. Now, you know that No. 2 is Antar, which Rimsky-Korsakov struggled about whether he should call it a symphony at all. And Antar is gorgeous. I mean, it's sort of like a rehearsal for Scheherazade. It's not as interesting as Scheherazade, but it's getting there. And it's luscious and beautifully scored, all 57 versions that Rimsky-Korsakov made of it. And the third symphony, it's really not bad. I mean, it's not wonderful. It's not a great Russian symphony in that sense, but it's Rimsky being pedantic essentially. But he was a very detailed composer and persnickety about the way he wrote things. And so the third has its moments. It's got a harp. I mean, it's pretty, but the first, oh my, because the first suffers from a few basic problems. First of all, it has no interesting tunes. It is not formally very successful. And Rimsky-Korsakov had not really learned yet how to compose when he wrote it. It is every bit a student-type piece. And again, it's one of those things, well, you listen to Scheherazade and the Russian Easter Overture and the opera suites, and you think, wouldn't it be great if this guy wrote symphonies? And then you realize that there are 3 of them, and you go, symphonies. It's kind of like Sibelius' Scaramouche. You go, yes, he wrote symphonies. And then you put them on, and the first symphony, and you just go, oh, okay, never mind. It consists entirely of academic inhibitions, sort of untouched by any shred of actual inspiration. So there you go. And along similar lines, because there's more than one of these suckers out there, the Grieg Symphony in C minor. We have to mention that. The Grieg Symphony in C minor is one of the big letdowns in musical history. It really is. An early student symphony doesn't have to be a bore. I mean, think of Bizet. Bizet's was a student symphony. It was like 18, and it's a flaming masterpiece. All you need to have is wonderful orchestration and terrific tunes. And if the form is kind of jury-rigged, it's not going to make any difference. If the tunes are great, it just doesn't matter. So we've got Grieg, who wrote this symphony, and he embargoed it. Rightly so. Supposedly he embargoed it because he heard Johann Svensson's 2 symphonies, which are incomparably better than Grieg's, while being also extremely uninteresting, I might add. Some people, claim that those are also pieces that are their worth is exaggerated well beyond their merit, because there were no 19th century great Norwegian symphonists. And so we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the Grieg was a big disappointment because, of course, once it was de-embargoified, we were able to finally listen to it. And everyone said, oh, this is great. This is great. We finally get a large work by Grieg besides the piano concerto and a few of the chamber pieces. But Grieg was a very self-aware guy. He knew what he was good at. He was not good at writing large orchestral works in traditional forms, aside from the piano concerto. which is based on Schumann's piano concerto. He had a good model for that, let's put it that way. And the chamber works are very successful because Grieg was inspired to write them, and they're beautiful of their type, and they're not huge, ambitious works. It has to do with, the idea of the symphony as a quote-unquote major statement sort of thing. So this symphony popped up, and it got recorded, and of course we all ran out and bought it. Oh, my word. There's not a single fascinating or memorable idea in it, and it goes through the motions, it does its thing, and then it stops, and we never have to listen to it again. And now, of course, the fascinating thing is, after that initial period, it received a bunch of recordings. Nobody has done it since. Nobody cares outside complete Grieg orchestral music collections, or something like that. Nobody bothers with it. And there's a reason. So Grieg didn't even have to embargo the work. It embargoed itself as soon as we had an opportunity to hear it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just proves that Grieg was right all along. And we can go and listen to all the great stuff, of which there's tons. And if he didn't write lots of music in large forms, who cares? This was a 19th century prejudice that sort of carried over into the 20th century, that composers don't matter unless they make grand, large statements in acceptable German-defined musical forms. Well, that's just a lot of crap. I mean, Eric Satie spent his career demonstrating that that's a lot of crap. And we should not even waste our time now in the 21st century here worrying about any of that nonsense. You just take the music as it comes, and Grieg wrote lots of great music. So after Grieg, well, we have to do Berlioz, Lélio. Yeah, what is Lélio? Well, like many of the works in this list, we were fascinated to learn that the Symphonie Fantastique has a sequel. Because you know what happens in the Symphonie Fantastique. An artist is infatuated, and he takes drugs, and he puffs away, and he hallucinates, and he dreams that he's murdered his beloved, and she pops up in all these scenarios, including the witch's Sabbath at the end, and that's where it ends. But of course, he wakes up. He wakes up. I mean, they didn't have Narcan in those days or whatever, but he didn't kill himself with his overdose. He just had hallucinations. And he wakes up and writes Lelio. Now, Lelio, I mean, there's no way to describe what Lelio is. Lelio is a hodgepodge of things that Berlioz wrote at various times. It does have a fabulous fantasy on Shakespeare's The Tempest, a big orchestral work in the middle of it. But there are vocal bits. There's a song. There's stuff. There's a melodrama. It's a grab bag. And even if you perform it as a sequel to the Symphonie Fantastique, like at the same concert, oh, what a letdown you are in for. You can't possibly do them in the order that it was intended. And of course, Berlioz gave his usual very, very specific performance instructions about, doing things in front of a curtain and doing this and doing that and putting this here and doing that there, all in the hope that this thing would somehow become interesting. Well, it never did, and it never has, and it's never caught on. And, you listen to it for the good bits and you ignore the rest. And that's just it. I mean, that's the saga of Lelio. It's hands down Berlioz's least interesting composition or major composition. And by the way, I do want to add, when it comes to comments and we talk about these things, I'm trying to talk about major compositions that are unimportant, not, little ephemeral incidental pieces. When we did Wagner, you were talking, I was talking about Rienzi. Some of you mentioned Das Lebensmahl der Apostel, which is a wonderful choice. I quite agree. It's up there with Wagner's least interesting works. But things like the American Centennial March and that stuff, those aren't interesting choices. Those are obvious things, of course. I mean, they're pot boilers that he wrote on commission for the money or whatever. I mean, composers always have to do hack work. And I'm not talking about hack work. I'm talking about what's supposed to be a masterpiece, or you think it would be, or it's a big thing or a major statement, and it turns out to be terminally uninteresting. So after Berlioz's Lelio, Schumann. A lot of you have said, well, I don't talk about Schumann enough, so now I'm going to talk about Schumann. His least interesting work, his third piano sonata, also known as the Concerto without Orchestra, for reasons that are completely beyond me, actually. It sounds like a very dull piano sonata in my view. Schumann didn't even quite know what to make of it. He didn't know how many movements it should have. He worked on it and tinkered with it. It's, Schumann was a fantast, a fantasist. He was best when he was using his imagination to create fabulous, whether it's Butterflies or Kreisleriana or the Davidsbündler Tänze or some of the more unusual piano works like the Songs of Dawn. He was also a very fine contrapuntist. He wrote wonderful contrapuntal works, the Four Fugues or whatever those things are, and some other stuff. He had many, many gifts. But writing music in large forms, as with so many romantic composers, Grieg being one, it was not a specialty. Even the symphonies. The symphonies have some terminally self-destructive sonata form movements. The first movement of the Rhenish Symphony is just such a case in point of a non-developing development section, but the thematic material is wonderful. Well, the third piano sonata, like everything Schumann wrote, because great composers write things, has its moments. It does, but I have yet to hear a performance, not even by, Vladimir Horowitz, not by people like that who do these things, that could make this into something special. And, I mentioned before, the early Schumann piano sonatas as being not terribly fascinating. And some of you have said, well, I like them. Well, that's not the answer. You can like anything you want. Everybody likes everything. My mother once told me about, it's that there is, when we were, growing up and starting dating and whatnot, she said, the thing that has always puzzled me, she said, because she taught a women's studies course in a public high school in Milford. She said, what always bothered me is that there is no such thing as a guy who is so repulsive that there isn't a girl with such a lack of self-respect that she won't love him. And that's how I feel about some of these works. Someone is going to love the Schumann Third Piano Sonata. Someone may think it's the greatest thing ever written. People marry serial killers. You see it all the time in prison, people marry criminals sight unseen, there's no accounting for taste. There isn't. But there is accounting for things such as formal shapeliness and melodic fecundity and harmonic interest. And I just think Schumann's Concerto Without Orchestra is a concerto without music. It's his least interesting large work. And so what? There's so many others that are not least interesting, that are fascinating. Everyone has their moment. So, yeah. Next, Elgar. Oh, yes, Elgar. Oh, you were tossing out the possibilities with Elgar, weren't you? You were desperate for me to mention The Dream of Gerontius, which I don't think is Elgar's least interesting work at all. I think the music is magnificent, and I think the libretto is appalling. And actually, that makes it all quite interesting, doesn't it? No. My choice for Elgar's least interesting work is not a choral work at all. It's Falstaff. Falstaff is the work that true Elgarians hold up as the acid test for your membership in the true Elgar society. You have to acknowledge Falstaff as Elgar's orchestral masterpiece. Now, the fact that nobody plays it outside of the UK and that nobody outside Elgar's little coterie of fanatics really thinks much of it doesn't seem to matter to these people, because it is, well, it's like, it's like a fraternity hazing or something. You have to put your hand in the hot oven or do something. You've got to go through some sort of rite of passage or initiation involving an unheard of degree of pain and suffering, or in this case, tedium, in order to prove your bona fides as a true believer. Well, I'm not a true believer, and I think Falstaff is just a snoozeroo. It's kind of like a cut-rate bargain basement gloss on Richard Strauss's Don Quixote. It's a character sketch, and it's just, I don't know. It just lays there. I mean, it has little interludes that sometimes people talk about separately, and charming moments and vignettes, and it has, and at the end it's kind of like Don Quixote, Hal, spurns Falstaff and he dies, and it's very sad. Oh my goodness, what a piece of hooey Falstaff is. I did not pick the cello concerto either, which I dislike, but which I wouldn't call his least interesting piece. I just don't like it. I mean, I just think it's boring. But Falstaff, reaches so much higher than the cello concerto does. And so the achievement is consequently all the more distressing for its lack of interestingness. And finally, here's one that one of you came up with right away, and I was really impressed that you mentioned it. Gershwin's Second Rhapsody. Yeah, I mean, I like the Second Rhapsody, but I have no problem calling it Gershwin's least interesting work. The reason it's his least interesting work is because Gershwin also, Pace, the Concerto in F, was not a guy to write tight forms in traditional forms. In any case, he needed fabulous tunes. And the Second Rhapsody, which is based on film music, by the way, is not something that has great tunes. I mean, it's just that opening. That's a good tune, but it doesn't go anywhere. The thing after that, it just kind of dribbles away. And I mean, it moves a lot. There's a lot of activity in it. And there is a piano solo, as in the Rhapsody in Blue. But boy, you compare the two. Just compare the two. And the answer is self-evident. Absolutely. The Second Rhapsody is just the most dismal sequel to one of the most fabulous originals. And, the rule is very simple. If you're going to do a sequel, it's got to be as great as the original, either because it's more of the same but as good, or because it's something completely different and totally legitimate in its own right. I mean, think of the movie Alien followed by Aliens with an S. They were completely different films, but they had a great premise. They had a fabulous creature that spits acid and eats people and has them hatch out of their stomachs. But on the one hand, you had just one on, a little spaceship with only a few people who gradually get devoured, except for Sigourney Weaver and her cat, I might add. And then you've got one where you've got a space colony with like billions of them running around, and everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And it's just exciting to watch them munch through a whole platoon of space marines. Well, it's just like that with Gershwin. I mean, you got the Rhapsody of Blue, one fabulous tune after another, a soulful solo piano part. I mean, it was the United Airlines, right? United Airlines airplane commercial, or maybe it was American. I don't know. It was an airline. And then you've got the Second Rhapsody that just doesn't do anything. It has none of the virtues of the first, and it isn't by itself extremely interesting of its type, because it sounds like a sequel that's just not as much fun as the original. End of story. So there you go. 10 fabulously uninteresting pieces by 10 fabulously interesting composers. The list is down below, and I'll see you again, maybe for a third installment. We'll see how it goes. So keep on listening, folks. Take care.